before Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined once again by Dr. Spencer Klavan. Spencer is Associate Editor of the Claremont Review of Books, host of the Young Heretics podcast, and author of Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God, which will be available by the time this podcast comes out. So I want to talk first of all, Spencer, about the preface by the mighty Stephen C. Meyer.
Ah,
Can you tell us a
yes.
little bit about your relationship with him and maybe how he's inspired your work and how that came about?
No question. Well, inspired is the right word. I think Stephen's book, Return of the God Hypothesis, is one of the most consequential books that's been published in my lifetime. And I say that advisedly because it is a profoundly countercultural book. The title refers to this story that is often told, which I tell in my book as well, about Pierre-Simon Laplace, one of the greatest French astrophysicists and a major interpreter of Isaac Newton in the generation just after the Principia Mathematica was published. And it's said that Laplace was summoned before Napoleon, and Napoleon asked, where is God in your vision of the world? You've charted out the movements of the stars and the planets so minutely, and you seem able to account for so many things. Where is God in this cosmology? And Laplace is said to have replied, I had no need of that hypothesis, in a very French and I think sort of understated but snide sort of way. Well, we don't need God anymore to explain anything. And Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, is an extremely rigorous, well documented, but also very, I think, readable story about how that attitude arose, became dominant, how the narrative was set in place that this whole scientific enterprise had displaced religion, and making the case that that's no longer true, that the science no longer supports the idea that there is no God, that certainly science has not and could not disprove the existence of God, but perhaps more forcefully, discoveries such as the Big Bang, which so called, the idea that the universe has a beginning, the nature of DNA, its character as code, which is to say, involving the communication, the symbolic communication of abstract ideas. These things have pointed us toward a high degree of plausibility for the God hypothesis, and perhaps even the necessity of the God hypothesis to make the best possible sense out of our discovery. So that's Stephen's book. And as he writes in the preface to my book, I am, in some sense, kind of riffing on this idea or exploring a dimension of it or a consequence of it. As I say in the book, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not here to tell you what the latest science says, but I am here as a historian of ideas, as an intellectual historian, just to point out that the picture of the world, which we inherited from that moment, that high noon, if you like, of materialism, kind of through the 18th and 19th centuries, and even, on down to our day, that picture of the world as a raw machine made out of matter is has way overstayed its welcome and has so fixed itself in the modern mind that we haven't even really taken stock of what Stephen is saying, of the discoveries in science that make God look much more plausible and make the world look much more like it looks or looked to the authors of Genesis. And so my book is an attempt really to say why that happened, why the materialist vision of the world was so compelling and remains so compelling even after the science has outstripped it, and to try to describe what the world can now look like to us as believers and as uh, as really seekers of knowledge of all kinds, including scientific knowledge, that the world now looks much more like the world in Genesis than perhaps it used to, and we should adjust our public mythology accordingly.
Excellent. Thanks, Spencer. And then next thing I'd like to ask you is there anything especially important about the form that you've actually laid the book out in? For me, it was
Mm.
very much a rich narrative, not unlike Stephen Meyer's book. And for me, I've been thinking about it and how it mirrors C.S. Lewis in some ways in engaging our faith, our reason, our imagination, the kind
Hmm.
of intellectual, spirited, appetitive parts of our soul, the good, the true, and the beautiful of the Christian life. I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit and
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the book is thank you, first of all. And second of all, the book is a story. It really does begin with the Chaldean astronomers of Babylon and the natural scientists of the ancient Greek world. And it extends all the way up to state of the art quantum physics. And it's divided into three acts, essentially. And I did sort of think of them as acts of a play or chunks of a story, and that's because I feel that we have, and one thing I hope to add to this discussion is that we have really erased or cut ourselves off from pre-modern history in this exact respect, in this respect of sort of our understanding of science and what science is and what it's doing. We kind of have this unspoken assumption that what we call science began around about the
Mhm.
1600s with Newton and maybe with Kepler, and maybe some people take the story back a little further to Galileo. And depending on how much you know, you might extend it back even further to the medieval era. But certainly there's some genesis point for science when the world comes online. And there's a way, of course, in which that's true. The scientific revolution did really transform our procedures for knowing about the natural world. But there's a deeper sense, I think, in which this enterprise needs to be understood as arising out of the longer history of mankind's quest for knowledge, and especially for an answer to the questions that are inscribed in our minds. We don't really take stock of the fact that the human mind itself is designed, I think, but certainly shaped to expect a kind of order in the universe. And that longing, that expectation has been on display for as long as human history has been recorded. And I think telling the story as an adventure and as, I think, a really exciting kind of narrative that can be read as almost like a novel or a story, the biography of a set of ideas, I think helps to see why it is that we veered off into this kind of materialist moment. The middle of the book is really telling the story of how what began as a fundamentally religious enterprise, the quest to know the world and understand its creator and its creative principles, became co-opted in the service of an anti-religious set of ideas. And then that way we can sort of understand ourselves not as living through some new era that's totally disconnected from everything that went before, but really actually more of an interlude in a grander story that stretches back deeper into the past and points forward toward a future that looks much more like the world as it was seen by the Greek researchers I talk about, but especially by the medieval scholars of Aristotle, who really did set the scientific uh, revolution in motion, but more than that, who understood the world as threaded through with divine intention and care, as answering, as being created by a mind which answers to our minds. Um, in the introduction, I say that my hope is that in the long view of history, this period of materialism that we've gone through will look more like a blip or a momentary misdirection, and that the grander vision of the world described by our wisdom traditions and by our scriptures will actually turn out to be the dominant strain in our history. So if I have a grand ambition for the book, it's that it will contribute to that turning back to our older trajectory.
mm, amen. I hope so. And that reminded me of Lewis also, and the fact that the most progressive one at times is the one who turns back when they're off course.
Hmm.
So that
Interesting.
was most helpful, and figures like Aristotle and Plato play a key part in your work, which is really interesting. But
Yeah.
I want to move next to the story of Galileo to blow apart some of the stereotypes. And this concept of saving the appearances that you mentioned in one of your chapters, fixing the stars. Would you
Mhm.
speak to that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. Well, of course, the Galileo story is, I mean, Galileo is patient zero for this narrative that the church is fundamentally anti-science, that it was the repressive forces of superstition and doctrine that kept science chained up for so long, and that in order to burst free, science had to break the bonds of religion. This is, I think, effectively what Voltaire meant when he said écraser l'infâme, which is something like destroy the hateful thing. He was talking about the church, and he was beginning to set in place this narrative that the church is what had kept science back. And Galileo is sort of trotted out as the exemplar of this because he did end up under, pretty comfy house arrest, but house arrest, and because his discovery of the heliocentric, we would now say solar system, that the sun is at the center and not the earth, and that we can understand our trajectory much better if we calculate that way, that this was placed on an index of effectively opinions you could teach as long as you then refuted them, but not if you wanted to claim that they were really true. Now, this morality tale that we tell based on that history that many of us learned in school is false on so many levels that it's almost difficult to peel back all the different layers. I mean, the first level on which is most obviously false is that Galileo was not an irreligious, an anti-religious, or an atheist man. He, in fact, was a devoted Christian, as were almost all the major architects of the scientific revolution. Certainly Newton, certainly Kepler, certainly Tycho Brahe. I mean, many of these guys were very much in the tradition of the faith, and their dispute was not with the Catholic Church over the existence of God, the usefulness of religion for answering ultimate questions. None of those things were at issue. What was going on was actually a dispute between religious people, between the authorities of the church and one of the church's faithful sons, about how best to respond to God's gift to us in creation. Galileo is saying, God made nature, God made my mind, I'm in his image, and therefore I should expect to know more and more about the world as I examine it. And that argument is the argument of the scientific revolution. The basis of the scientific revolution is that because we're made in the image of God, we can expect that these weird things in our heads called numbers are not just going to apply to our immediate and evolutionary environment, but are actually going to extend throughout all the universe. And the universe is going to yield up more and more reason and logic as we go throughout the heavens. It was the atheists who advised caution on this point. It was David Hume who said, what right do you have to expect that? And that was because he didn't believe in the idea of the image of God. And you actually need that idea, we're now discovering, to justify the expectation that scientific paradoxes will resolve themselves. So that's the first thing about Galileo, and I try to make that clear in the book. But I also try to make clear at a deeper level something perhaps somewhat more subtle. And this is one of the key points in the book, and I'm glad you asked me about it, that there's a sharper and deeper, more penetrating point at issue between Galileo and the Catholic Church, on which it's very far from clear that Galileo was absolutely in the right. And that is this matter of saving the appearances, as you indicate. For most of the history of astronomy, thanks to Plato, there was this idea that mathematical models can only ever be approximations of reality. That math doesn't, at least math as it occurs to the human mind, can make sense of the world, but can't replace the world. That it's not the bedrock reality, it's rather a description of reality. Alfred Korzybski would later say that the map is not the territory. And that issue is actually the basis underlying the whole Galileo controversy, because it's Galileo who says, and before him, Copernicus, that using the sun as the center of the universe or the solar system isn't just a convenient idea for your calculations. Before that, you could say, well, if we think of the sun as at the center, then the equations work out this way. But if we think of the Earth at the center, then the equations work out this way. And you can do this in a number of different ways in science. Ptolemy and Eudoxus, two of the astronomers of the ancient world, had varying ways of kind of arranging the spheres and understanding their rotation. But it was understood that as long as the equations worked out to the same predictions, these were functionally the same because they were both just descriptions of an underlying reality. And the fundamental thing underneath the descriptions was the human experience, the human observation of the planets and the reality of the planets themselves. It was on that point that the church contested Galileo. They wanted to say that mathematics is a human device for knowing the world, but not the ultimate reality of what exists, full stop. And Galileo wanted to say that his telescope and his calculations and his formulas could reveal nature, could strip reality naked and get us past mere human perception. And that's why he invented a distinction that would become very important for the modern world, which is a distinction that we now call the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So the idea here is that if I'm looking, say, at a book on a table, there's certain things about the book that would be true no matter what, that are inherent in the reality of the book, like that there's only one, or that it only has 270 pages, not 271, how much it weighs. These quantities that are associated with it are primary qualities. But the color of the book, maybe the smell of its pages, the way it looks to me, my human experience of it is secondary, which is to say it only exists in relationship with me. And it's only a short step from there to the idea that everything about the experience of the book that's merely human is expendable, is just a kind of illusion or an accident, and we could dispense with it and do away with it. And gradually, in the wake of the scientific revolution, that idea starts to really take hold, that only numbers, only matter is real, and the human mind is a kind of screen, an unhelpful screen that's layered onto the real truth, which is atoms in motion. And especially once you start to get an account of mankind that builds him up out of evolutionary causes, then it really starts to look like our humanity is a total arbitrary irrelevancy. It just happens to be how we first got access to the real truth, which is matter in motion. And the reason that's so important is because ultimately the whole movement that we call post-humanist or transhumanist, this kind of creepy technological argument that we're destined basically to surpass our humanity, is based on an extreme version of this idea that our human way of experiencing the world is just an accident, and color and light, sound, desire, dreams, emotion, everything that only exists in our minds, it has no real true solidity, no real reality. And it's that issue that I am here in this book essentially to contest, because it turns out that even primary qualities, even things like position in space, location in time, are also mediated by necessity through the human mind. Quantum physics suggests to us that outside of that experience, it might even be meaningless to speak of such things as position and even perhaps quantity in the ways that we think of them. So this whole idea of the world as a kind of machine and humanity as a primitive, as the robots 1.0, is founded on a false premise. And so Galileo is really important, not only because of his genius and his brilliance, not only because he was actually much more religious than the typical narrative lets on, but because the issue at stake between him and the church was even more profound and more complex than we typically let on to be. And in that point, the point of saving whether our mathematics can describe reality at its bedrock, we are only now realizing that actually the church had a point to make on that score.
Oh, I'm into that, Spencer. And in your book, in chapter in The Birth of the Small Gods, for example, you chart this course to a conception of the cosmos that's lawful and which we could grasp in some ways by way of figures like Descartes and Newton, who actually were professing Christians. So it's not like a propaganda piece where you're blaming them as simple villains of
Mm.
history and so on. But I want to ask you a little bit about that and some of the major contours of that move to the small gods of modernity and why that was significant then?
Certainly. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the idea that there are no villains because, there really aren't villains of this story. Now, the closest we come is the French,
Of
which is
course.
just my Americanness showing through, I guess. But the closest we come is with Pierre Simon Laplace and with the French Revolution, and perhaps secondarily the Soviet Revolution. But even there, what I'm trying to show here is not things were going along just great until those nasty scientists messed everything up, but rather we've been on an intellectual trajectory, and a lot of it might have been necessary. Even our detour into materialism, and I suggest this in the book, might have been a necessary exile that we sort of imposed upon ourselves in order to bring greater form and shape to our understanding, but that now the time has come to come back home. And so yeah, as you say, the guys, the major players in the Birth of the Small Gods chapter, which really is where this the groundwork of this materialism is laid. None of them are scheming villains. None of them are even apostates. I mean, Newton had a very unorthodox form of Christianity, but he was a real believer, and Kepler especially was fixated on the idea of the harmony of the universe. So, what actually happened is sort of the question of that chapter. And the answer essentially is that Newton's discovery of the laws of motion and the principle of gravity um, delivered on a hope that mankind had been clinging to for its entire intellectual history. It's the hope that underwrites astronomy. It's also the hope that underwrites divination and magic and alchemy, the idea that you could boil the world down, at least the physical world down, to its simplest elements so that you could organize it according to cause and effect. If you think about the principle, even of some priest in Babylon cutting open a lamb and looking at the guts to figure out who's going to win the next battle. Of course, we know that he can't figure anything out that way, but the logic of his enterprise is actually quite sound, which is if there are causes and effects, then looking at the causes will enable you to chart the effects and perhaps even to intervene in them to change and control the future. It just turns out that there's no connection, causal or otherwise, between the entrails of lambs and the victory of King Ashurbanipal. That's just not how that works. But the logic of, say, astronomy, which says, when Venus is in this position in the sky, you can predict that tomorrow Venus will be in this other position. And the logic then of science, which says, if you set up the component parts of an atom in this way and you do this to them, this will happen. This is basically magic. It's just magic that works. That's what Arthur C. Clarke says about sufficiently advanced technology. And so Newton was able to write the rules of magic that worked with greater clarity and simplicity and for a larger area of space than had ever been done before. That was his great achievement. And the proof of it was that he broke through a barrier that had previously been thought to prevent the human mind from advancing further, the superlunary barrier. There was this idea derived from Aristotle that past the moon, different rules applied. And maybe the human mind wasn't even capable of fully grasping those rules. But down here, we have this kind of sin-laden world where things fall to the ground and we can kind of understand those rules. But then there are different rules up beyond the superlunary barrier. And because Newton's laws apply both to planets and to billiard balls, suddenly that barrier vanishes. And it looks as if there is a rule book for describing the motion of everything throughout the universe. And suddenly, if you take that idea and you put it together with the idea that we were talking about earlier, the idea that mathematics can give an exhaustive bedrock description of reality, then it looks like there might be such a thing as a mathematical model that just is the world, that enables you to turn the world into a machine. And if that's true, if the world is built up out of quantifiable objects that behave according to predictable laws, then perhaps there's a smallest possible object. In fact, there must, in some sense, be a smallest possible object, since you're dealing with numbers, there has to be a number one. And suddenly this old idea of atomism, which was very powerful in, say, the days of the Epicureans, comes back as the exhaustive description of the world and of the universe. And Newton himself, although he never claimed to have discovered materialism or the, underlying machinery of the world, and though he was at pains to stress that the world has a creator, needs a creator to make sense, so on and so forth, worried that what he had discovered would open the way to people saying, well, why would we need reference to God at all if everything can be described in numbers? And that's the birth of the small gods. It's the replacement of first and final cause with this notion, this idea of the atom as the eternal underlying reality that can never be seen or touched, but is always present, that causes our sensation. So when we see light, when we hear sound, all these things, we can now give a material account of these things that refers them to atomic motion. And so it was very tempting to think, well, atoms must just be the building blocks of the universe. You don't need anything else but atoms to account for things. And if that's true, then atomic motion effectively is what we think of as divine will, because it is just as ironclad, just as absolute, and appealingly, unlike the will of God, the creator, atoms can be controlled. And there's a hope, perhaps, even that if everything is atoms, then we can intervene using the ideas behind atoms to kind of control the world. Um, this was always doomed to failure, and the most astute observers at the time, Newton included, would have realized that reducing the world to atomic machinery was a fool's errand. But the appeal of it was so great that it almost couldn't help but burst forth as kind of this new form of atheism. Bacon, one of the other major figures in that chapter, Francis Bacon, basically says, in discovering the atom, we have discovered the true nature of the pagan gods. He compares the natural motion of the atom to Cupid or Eros, love, desire, that things desire to go certain ways. And that's basically what the ancient myths were talking about when they talked about, for example, as in Hesiod, the love that is present at the beginning of the world. So it becomes a sort of replacement theology, a sort of paganism. And it's all the more powerful because, at least today, we don't recognize it as such. We don't recognize it as a theology. We think of it just as the way things are. But actually, materialism is a form of theology. It's a form of paganism mixed with Epicureanism. And I think it was born during those centuries of Descartes and Newton, even though Newton himself would have been appalled by it.
Hmm. Absolutely. So unfortunately, we don't have time to go through everything in the book. It's such a rich book. I
Mm.
want to move on to part two and circle back to something that you mentioned before. So the
Yeah.
chapter, A Strange Kind of Chemical Change. So something that Ayan Hirsi has lamented, and I think she's right, is the lack of the West dealing thoroughly with communism in a manner comparable to how we did with Nazism. And you write
Mm-hmm.
about that Soviet spirit that you mentioned that still haunts the world. I wonder if you
Mm-hmm.
might describe that a bit and its relationship to the machine, which reminded me of our friend Paul Kingsnorth and John Lennox and some of their work.
Yeah, yeah, no question. I think this is right. And I think we're really the Hersey Ali comment is really important because I don't know about you. I was finished with grad school before I ever read Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And if you think about what a gaping lacuna that is in my education, and you compare it to how early and how often I read detailed accounts of the Holocaust, you will realize that there is this wild imbalance in the way that we treat the atrocities of the 20th century. And you have to tread very carefully here because all atrocities are atrocities, and the loss of any human life is a tragedy. And certainly the Holocaust is an atrocity that staggers the mind. But it has become, if possible, even more than that. I think it has become a founding myth for our new cosmology and ethics and demonology. It's sort of placed like at the bottom of Dante's hell as the still point of all evil. And other kinds of evil, because they are more politically palatable to our elite classes have been widely disregarded. And of course, Soviet evil is the classic example that we really don't think of Stalin. We haven't been trained to think of Stalin as the great monster that he was, or to ask what was the logic that gave rise, perhaps both to Hitler and to Stalin. Are there underlying kind of principles at play? And so my small contribution to that effort in this book is the chapter on, yeah, Nietzsche, Marx, and the rise of the Soviet Union. And it is bound up with the development of what I call the idea of the man machine. And I kind of tease this in the introduction by saying that, the idea that we have about what the world is made of always turns out to be an idea also about what we are made of, because we are in the world. And so if you think that all there is in the world is just a collection of atoms moving around, eventually the idea is going to occur to you that we are just a collection of atoms moving around. And so we think we're dominating the world by gaining control over the small gods, but actually we are falling under the sway of the small gods. We're becoming subject to atomic motion. And that idea that we are just, as it's now often put, chemistry sets in meat sacks really starts to take shape in the 19th century and on into the 20th century until you get pop songs, which is where that title is taken from. A Strange Kind of Chemical Change is from a pop song where you just Nat King Cole just sings a strange kind of chemical change goes rushing through me. We all know he means love. We all know he means that like love is just a release of chemicals. And there's nothing, again, there's nothing sinister about that. He's not sitting around rubbing his hands, or the author of that song is not sitting around rubbing his hands thinking, how can I develop an inhuman and degrading picture of man as fluids and meat? But that is the idea that is starting to take hold. And I think we see that idea reach its apogee, at least we see it in its rawest form in the Soviet Union and in the rise of Marxism, which just is the attempt to take the scientific method and import it into history and the study of relationships between people. And of course, it's part of a larger movement once science gains the credibility that it now has, once it starts to look like this exhaustive account of truth itself. And once the word science, which just means knowledge, becomes synonymous with material knowledge of the natural world, then suddenly all other disciplines, in order to be legitimate, have to claim, appropriate for themselves the mantle of a science. If it's not a science, it's not true. Therefore, all truth must be assimilated to science. And that's what Marx wants to do for history. He wants to create a history of science that reduces it to the logic of inexorable cause and effect and determinism. These things, the wheel of history is churning on in this way. And again, since history is the story of human beings, to think about history as science is to think about human beings as raw matter. And we do end up in the Soviet Union with exactly that mentality, that human beings are cogs in a giant political, historical machine. Lenin is quite explicit about this. Find tougher people, hang these people and find tougher ones. Stalin in his Purge and some of Stalin's minions, as described in Solzhenitsyn, talk about human beings and the justice owed to them as merely a kind of appendage of the party machine. And the wages of that, in the tune of millions of dead, starved, tortured, executed, is already staring us in the face. We already see where this machine logic goes. If we look, it's just that we've prevented ourselves from looking for political reasons of our own. So yeah, I do think the Soviets are very important in this story as an illustration. And I almost think of them as French Revolution Part Two. If you think of the French Revolution as this impulse to clear away all the old superstition and replace it with pure reason, which is usually understood in numerical terms, the Marxist uprising and the sort of history of Marxism is the effort to do that in an even more sweeping and rigorous and uncompromising way, and the death toll rises accordingly.
Mm. And I want to touch upon another part of part two, the Tower of Babel, where
Hmm.
you look at the profound theoretical and practical impact of quantum science, including the atomic bomb, even. I wonder
Yeah.
if you might tell us about these dark clouds and then the silver lining of human experience that reappears at the center of our science and its role in redressing that fact value split and that more mechanical conception.
No question. Yeah, I happily will. So the reason the chapter is called the Tower of Babel is actually not, as you might expect, because I'm here saying the evil architects of this world machine were trying to impose one world order upon everybody. Now, as I've just said at length about the Soviet Union, that's perfect. It's perfectly true that that is the case. And I think that the Tower of Babel story is our most profound image of this very impulse, which has arisen at various times throughout history to bring all things forcibly under one logic as dictated by a human ruler. That's what that story is about. It's about a public works project dictated by an ancient Near Eastern king. And it's been pointed out by others besides myself that that is eerily similar to some of this, like, Klaus Schwab rhetoric about bringing everybody under one world order, one world government. But that's actually not, at least initially, the reference that I make in that chapter. Instead, I'm talking about a much lesser known episode in history from 1927, which is I believe it's the fifth Solvay conference. The Solvay conferences are major annual summit in quantum physics. And in 1927, the greatest minds in physics, Einstein, Bohr, Ehrenfest, I mean, you name them, Schrodinger, Louis de Broglie, were getting together to discuss de Broglie's proposal of what is now called wave particle duality, the idea that somehow the smallest particles in atoms and even in light can behave under various conditions alternately as waves or as matter. And waves, we don't even know waves of what. It seems like immaterial waves of perhaps probability. And at the end of that conference, Paul Ehrenfest, one of the world's greatest mathematicians, got up and wrote on the blackboard a verse from the book of Genesis. Go to, let us go down and scramble their speech, said the Lord, that they may not understand one another. Because Ehrenfest was describing the profundity with which scientists who are supposed to have the universal language, the language of mathematics that communicates perfectly from mind to mind, had no way of interpreting the results of their theories or their experiments, that the equations they were working with had started to deliver results that were impossible to interpret in terms of a mechanical picture of the world. Once you get down to the level of the photon or the level of the electron, and you try to either describe or ultimately measure what they do, there are things that photons and electrons do that we just cannot picture. And this is where they say if you understand quantum physics, you don't understand it. I don't think that's quite true. I think it is possible to grasp what's going on in quantum physics, but what they really mean is if you can picture quantum physics, you don't understand it, because every image we use to picture quantum physics is a material image. So we'll talk about, well, particles take multiple paths at once, like and we picture them sort of, a photon like splitting apart in two through a half silvered mirror and then splitting apart again, or coming back together to rejoin. Or you'll say things like, well, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle means that if you know the momentum of a particle with exactitude, you don't know its location. Or if you're not looking at a particle, you don't know its location. And we think, therefore, that the particle is sort of flitting about in a realm of space, but that it's still somewhere. It's just maybe like smushed out into a jelly that occupies a larger area or something like that. But none of that is true in quantum physics. What quantum physics is actually saying is that there is no definite location to the particle outside of our conception or our measurement of the particle. Once you measure the particle, then you can say it's here or there. Before that happens, all you can say about it, the bedrock really of what it is the possibility of being in a range of places and the likelihood of being in a range of places. The Schrodinger wave and its solutions, solutions to the Schrodinger wave functions basically tell you, like, if you look for a particle, you are 50% likely to find it here and like 0.001% likely to find it in the Grand Canyon. And like, I'm being a bit facetious, but that's kind of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with raw potential in its essence. And this is what brings the Tower of Babel crashing down, because ultimately there is a Tower of Babel here, and it is the picture of the world as this machine with totally independent from human perception and human experience. And it turns out that even that machine requires us to be the way we picture it to be, that all reality as we know it is funneled through the categories of the human mind. As Immanuel Kant had kind of guessed in advance, that even things like time and space are real, but they're real primarily as formal relationships that are inherent in human consciousness. We can't choose not to experience time and space. We can't undo time and space just by thinking really hard about it. But we also can't avoid time and space coming into being through our existence. It's us in the world that kind of create time and space, not by choice, but simply by existing. And if that's the case, I argue in the book, then whatever is true out there, outside of us, it ain't a dead machine. It ain't a bunch of particles moving around and colliding mindlessly with one another. It's something much more like a formless void waiting to meet with a mind that sees it and calls it good.
Excellent. Thank you, Spencer. We're going to leave a fair bit out, but in the third part of the book, there is a chapter on the word, which I think builds upon what you're saying. And you caution against both this objectivism and subjectivism, materialist and new age woo-woo in equal measure,
Yeah.
you might say,
Yeah.
Deepak Chopra or Richard Dawkins, and you proffer a richer vision of communion instead. I wonder if you might go into that a little bit.
Definitely. I think this chapter, which might be my personal favorite in the book, is where I kind of deliver on the promise to show how this whole long story, this journey we've just been on that brings us to a new vision of the world in quantum physics, is the vision of the world presented in the book of Genesis. And we just haven't recognized this really fully enough because it's been presented to us as so terribly distinct. Science and religion have nothing to do with one another. But now, when you start to talk about the idea that the mind meets with matter and that in that communion, the world is born, reality is born, there's a few different routes that you can go. One is just to sort of ignore this idea and maintain this arid, dry objectivism. And by that, I mean the idea that the world is made of objects, right? That we, the subjects of perception, are irrelevant, accidental, we're not necessary really to make the world as it is in its most fundamental way. And I think, and I came to think this while writing the book, that there is another possibility that people have taken, and it actually explains not only sort of new age woo woo, but also postmodernism, which is really fun because I love to think of the postmodernists as sort of like akin to crystal girls. That this flight, this headlong flight away from objectivism into pure subjectivism, that the world is what I make of it, that I alone create the world in my mind, or else that language is merely power relations, which is to say it's just whoever can exert his own will or subjectivity over others. I mean, all of these are forms of ideas that crop up in both New Age spiritualism and postmodernism. And they are reactions to against objectivism, sometimes even using quantum physics in this sort of pseudoscientific way to be like, well, quantum physics shows that the world is what you make of it, right? So we can just imagine the world and do anything else. Now, that's simply not the case. That's just not how quantum physics works. If you observe, if you extract information from a system such that a particle is in a particular location, I can't then go away and like by thinking about it, rewrite that history or that world. I can't. Nothing has changed about the normal everyday life that we experience. I can't summon electricity by thinking about lightning bolts shooting through my fingertips. Like none of that is true. What is true is that the world seems to be invested with not form exactly, but the potential for form. That when we experience the world, when we see things, when we categorize them, when I see an animal walking in front of me and I call it a cat instead of a dog, I'm imposing a form on the cat to a certain extent. I'm recognizing not just this one particular animal, but the whole class of animals that I call cat. But I'm also drawing out of the world at something that is implicit in the world, that there is a kind of structure baked into the world that we make whole and final in our perception of the world. And this is very, very close to the deep philosophy and theology of language. Usually, when we talk about language, we talk about the words that I'm speaking to you right now, the sounds that I make, the symbols that I scribble, et cetera, et cetera. But really, that's just the tip of an iceberg, right? When I say language, what I'm really doing is I'm giving communicable form to something that's going on within me, to some thought that I'm having, to some experience, some perception. And it's that perception, the ancient philosophers would have said, and Thomas Aquinas would have said, that counts as the first words. When you see the world and you imprint it with form, when you gather your perceptions into order and structure, that's the beginning of language. That's the word in your soul. And it corresponds to a word that was written and ready to be read in the world. And this is the situation that's described not only in Genesis, I think, but also in John's prologue. When John says the not one thing was created without the word, and when the author of Genesis says that the Spirit of God hovered over the formless and void waters and spoke these different things into existence, the beasts after their kind, right? All these categories and types that Genesis describes coming into being. What happens at the very end of that? Well, all of those things are seen in order to be created. First, they're spoken as words, then they are seen, that is experienced by the mind of God, and then they are named by us, by man. So you have a picture of the world as formless potential brought into being through speech, invested with the possibility of language, and then finally named by a creature made in the image of God. And if that doesn't sound to you like a world that is raw potential until it meets with a conscious mind, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think that these two descriptions of the world are now almost kind of in alignment, and it just takes our sort of reconfiguration of our vision to see that that's what's going on. That we are developing a picture of the world that is richly, and I would say quite meaningfully described in Genesis. Now, I'll say one last thing and then I'll stop. Does that mean that the author of Genesis was like given a preview of quantum physics and the Schrodinger equations by God? Like, no. And I ultimately, it also doesn't mean that the Schrodinger equations prove God. I mean, you can give other interpretations of them. You can make arguments, some of which I take up in the book and try to refute. But, in the end, what I'm not saying is Genesis describes quantum physics or quantum physics proves God. Instead, what I'm saying is Genesis is a template of a pattern that goes right down to the bedrock of the universe. You want to know what the world is made of, read Genesis and understand that it's made of the communion between mind and matter. And then from there, we can start to interpret and realize what's going on in quantum physics. It's one expression, the material expression of a reality that finds itself expressed and replicated in every sphere of life, that the world is made not out of dead objects, not out of your pure subjective ideas or fantasies, but out of the meeting, like the meeting of a reader with a text, the meeting of mind and matter.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much, Spencer. And to conclude today, then, where can my viewers or listeners find out more about you, your work, the new book, of course, and follow your thoughts and writing?
Thank you for asking, and thank you for reading the book so carefully. It's always a joy to talk to somebody. I know, Marcus, I mean, we've talked about this stuff, so I know that you're like uh genuinely engaged with it, which is awesome. And I really hope your listeners will like this book. Yeah, as you say, the first thing to do really is just to order the book on Amazon or wherever you get your books. It is available in various formats there. And if you'd like to reach out to me and know more and get to know my podcast or some of my ramblings on Twitter, the easiest way to do that is at my Substack, which is rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's how you can read all my writings. It's kind of a clearinghouse where I bring a lot of stuff. And it's also a way that you can get in touch with me. And it's a way that you can find other projects that I am up to. So Light of the Mind, Light of the World, and then rejoiceevermore.substack.com.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time, Spencer. It's been a pleasure as ever, and God bless you and your work.
What a delight. God bless you right back. And thank you, my friend.